Welcome back to the Inside Athletic Training Podcast and Research Rundown, Episode 4, featuring Brad Pearson of the Boston Red Sox on training load and injury risk. Hosted by Paul Buchheit and Joe Rauch of the Philadelphia Phillies, the guys discuss what the research actually says about workload and injury, challenge some common assumptions, and break down what it all means for athletic trainers working in real-world settings. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Research Rundown on the Inside Athletic Training Podcast. My name is Joe Rauch. I'm assistant athletic trainer with the Philadelphia Phillies. With me today is Paul Buchheit, Director of Medical Services and Head Athletic Trainer for the Philadelphia Phillies. And our guest today, Brad Pearson, Vice President of Sports Medicine with the Boston Red Sox. Brad is going into his 24th season overall in various roles with the Red Sox. Currently serves on PBAT's executive board as well as Major League Baseball's research committee. Brad, thanks for taking the time and hanging out with us this morning.
Yeah, awesome to be here. And, Paul, when we were together, we always had these conversations about a million different topics, and I always enjoyed them. So I'm hoping to do the same today.
Well, you picked an excellent topic, and it's a broad scope. And today we're going to be talking workload monitoring, and kind of diving into a paper from January in 2021, training load and injury, causal pathways and future directions, Kalkov and Watsford and that group. And it's a kind of a scoping review and a take on the workload dynamic and how it impacts us as athletic trainers. And it feels like this topic is growing. The conversation is becoming more at the forefront of what we're doing overall and on a day-to-day basis. And it can kind of go in a number of different ways. So I'd love to just start there, Brad, and just get your take and maybe your definition of what is workload and how does it impact us as athletic trainers?
Yeah, it is kind of a hot topic, but even back into this when pitch counts started happening, I think workload started coming to the forefront, particularly on the pitching side. To me, it's an umbrella term, so it encompasses a lot of different components of the game and components of training. And basically, what we care about is the tissue stress as clinicians, and that's what we're trying to control for and understand better. So separating it out, if you can, into an external load versus an internal load is certainly a reasonable strategy to do, and try and find the physiological response to that. And then where the rubber hits the road is trying to measure that and measure it well, and make it a useful tool for you.
So, Brad, the article, by Kalkov and colleagues, Impel, I'm going to say this wrong, Impel Azari.
Tom Franco.
Yeah, Franco. He's wrote a lot about dismissing ACWR and all this stuff. But he also, in this article, they talk about the psychophysiological and how some of those metrics that are being tracked can be speculative at best as well. How do you weigh this article and what they're talking about without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? By boiling down to what could be operational?
Yeah. I think first of all, you can go down many, many rabbit holes of picking apart perhaps spurious metrics like the ACWR and try to find common ground on its use case or not. And is that each of these measurements that we think from a clinical standpoint have impact on tissue stress, we want to try to quantify it. We try to control it. We try to mitigate it so that we can optimize player performance and health. And so it is a big task. I think like each individual component that we're talking about, whether it's pure external load or these psychophysiological sides, each require an analysis and synthesis of, is this relevant? Are we able to measure it well without a ton of error? And then if we are putting it all together into a dashboard with an algorithm, are we multiplying errors and coming up with something that at the end we were better off just using our eyes and our intuition and our clinical reasoning skills. I think that's where the rubber meets the road with all of this. So I didn't really answer the question of how to do this, and I think that'd be straightforward in saying, like, look, if the paper makes criticism of different methodologies of tracking workload, I would be first in line to say that I have probably tried most, if not all of them, and have probably been guilty of making mistakes along that way.
Yeah, I would say I think we all are, right? I mean, in every sport. But again, I guess throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what does that leave you with? I don't know. You said it best, I think, is that it comes down to the clinical reasoning of the clinician or practitioner to appraise the data and fact check that. I don't know. Same thing could be said about biomechanics, right? You have assumptions based on assumptions with limitations built in, but we use that as the holy grail for a lot of things. So I think you said that best, but I'll kick it back to you, Joe, and see.
Well, I'm curious because it feels like it's evolving, and for me there's a place that trial and error kind of works here a little bit, because you're learning and making adjustments along the way. Like we're constantly doing the best we have with the information and the things that are available to us, and with so much information like available, I guess I'm curious what your guys' take is on how you decide. Like, how do you choose what you're tracking and being consistent with that tracking? Like maybe season to season, as you kind of reevaluate your processes, or we look at what we're doing, versus staying consistent versus maybe making adjustments, and how you are able to compare those things over time. You probably want to be able to track guys that we have long careers with that are on our teams, and be able to compare year 5 of their career to year 1, and et cetera. But you also want to make those consistent adjustments to, okay, I'm not sure this is as relevant as it used to be, or maybe it is now. Maybe an aging player has different things that are relevant versus a younger player when you talk about tissue adaptation and stress, acclimatization, things like that, Brad. So I'd love your take on just maybe the evaluation process of what you're measuring and how you make decisions on what's valuable.
Yeah, again, like, I think everybody's trying to solve a very complicated problem with something simple. And to pick on the ACWR a little bit, I would say, like, that was kind of the ultimate workload metric that tried to do that. And I think where I've landed on it is that we have to be probably a little more transparent with these metrics, and tell ourselves and others, like, what it does and what it doesn't do, and where those error bars exist. So, putting it into a ratio was supposed to normalize things so that you could control the chronic versus the acute. And Franco and his crew just basically proved that didn't really work. So it doesn't mean that we don't care about chronic load, and it doesn't mean that we don't care about an acute spike in workload. But I think we'd all agree that there is some sort of detrimental effect happening with someone who is doing more work in a rapid amount of time. I think the paper really does a good job of talking about that, and kind of getting into the weeds of the SN curve. And, for me, just relating that to the stress strain curve. So what are these two things, and how does that apply to what we're looking at as clinicians? I would say, understanding the cyclical loading aspects, especially for pitching, if we want to, dig in on that. I think one of the key statistics that came out of the paper was a reference to a 10% decrease in the magnitude of the stress can double the number of cycles. So you can have a 100% increase in the number of cycles. So if we're thinking about that, extrapolating with pitching, if the person is at their max effort throw, and we can decrease that by just 10%, we can double the number of times they can do it. I think that actually is very meaningful in our training programs and our workload management. I'll pause there and see if there's any things you guys want to add to that.
Yeah, I have so much I want to ask you now. So the study, the article talks about how, they dismissed ACWR there's many studies that show that there is a correlation of training load and high ACWR, whether chronically or acute, associated with injury. So it's like, okay, so now you got them on both sides. However, you talked about the set point of where the strain occurs. Could we be seeing players have all these different set points, and where their failure point's going to be is not going to be the same as another guy? And so, do you think that ACWR monitoring external load is individualistic? And could you theoretically try to find that set point for each individual player based on other information you're bringing in? What's their tissue substrate? What are their strength and range of motion numbers? What's their risk analysis? Like, does that help you say this guy could maybe handle a little bit higher workload at all?
Yeah, I think that's where, you have to live in the world of individuality, because we all know that there will be some individuals that can handle a load that maybe is even above what our league-wide norms and tolerate it very well. And then others with much less load for some reason are not able to. So, the use of things like Z-scores to understand what their typical load is and how much more week over week or whatever value you're looking at, they're doing more or less versus that that standard that they've demonstrated an ability to tolerate, I think is useful. And really cool stuff is getting into, what kind of tissue they have and how their collagen is made up, because I think that's really the key thing here. When you're looking at an SN curve and trying to predict how many cycles somebody can handle, what you're trying to do really is understand, what their tolerance is. And it can be highly individual based on a myriad of factors, and it could be tissue quality. So, what you want to do in a training regimen or even monitoring throughout a season is ensure that the adaptation is outpacing the fatigue. So we know that the guys are going to get fatigued. If a starter goes and throws 100 pitches and then he has 5 days before his next start, you're looking hopefully to be in a situation that's anabolic, not catabolic, and that by the time the next start happens, they've adapted and certainly recovered before they go back and do it again. I think when we run into problems is when fatigue is outpacing the rate of the adaptation. So you could look at things like, what are they doing on their side day? Are they doing too much? For a reliever, the back-to-back doesn't necessarily allow the refractory period for collagen synthesis and remodeling. And because of that, are we getting into this, again, going back to, which I thought was the most interesting part of the engineering part, ironically, was the most interesting part of the paper, was this micro trauma that happens over time. So if you're putting cracks in the cement and then you're trying to let the body patch it up, and you're not letting that patch dry, and you're putting it back out there, then over time you're degrading the quality of that, let's say ligament, and asking to do sometimes the same amount of work, but with a poorer substrate. And now you start getting into stress strain curve where, this what used to be a normal load that the tissue could handle, but now that has changed because of the microtrauma that has developed with that cyclical loading.
Well, I think the context with which you guys just kind of went through that is it kind of perks my ears up, because it seems the workload conversation for me always ends up going to recovery and not being available to play or taking more rest time or whatever. And I think while that's important to be able to monitor those things of when we should push it, Paul mentioned something like, when are we picking out when somebody can handle a little bit more load, and when can they handle being pushed a little bit more? And for me, that's where I go with workload monitoring in general across, is it's not about pulling back and taking time away. It's about maximizing players' availability, right? And then moving into the performance side of things of where they're not just available to play on a more consistent basis, especially when we play every day, but they're available to play well. And Brad, you just kind of got into it a little bit about that, monitoring how the tissue is adapting to the work and being able to come back the next day. We talk about pitchers, starting pitchers in their routine, but the bullpen has to come in and be able to available every day. And then we haven't even really kind of touched on position players yet, obviously, which is a whole different ball game to go down. But I'm just curious where you take this on a day-to-day basis, Brad, from combining the two things we're talking about here, which is like the metrics and the objective measures and all of these different things that we're kind of talking about that lead to the workload decision making. But also when you have player A sitting on the table with you and he pitched last night and you're assessing him and you're using your clinical skills as an athletic trainer, like how do those two things blend for you to make a decision on when we can maybe push a guy or how we make them available?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean that's our job, right? So like it doesn't matter sometimes what the numbers say. We have a game to play, and somebody has to go out there and field a position. So I think though where I've kind of really started to focus on is more of a tolerance feedback loop. So really doing a good job of saying like, okay, like we are tracking what their workload is, but let's be really excellent at evaluating their tolerance to that. And that's where some of the monitoring tools can happen where, whether you're monitoring shoulder strength, shoulder range of motion, elbow and grip strength and things like that. And putting your hands on the player and saying like, hey, like the tissue quality is different than what I have typically seen, and I treat him preventatively with maintenance programs every day. And then you have a conversation with them, and that's where RPEs and session recovery RPEs can come into play and ask the player. And we've found that talking to people across all sports, that's still probably the number one tool that they feel is most valuable is having a conversation with the player. And I know that's not sexy or sounding scientific, but it still probably is one of the best tools that we have. So you're predicting a load that you think they can tolerate, and that's the best you can do with programming. And then you're evaluating them with whatever tools you have to say, okay, did they tolerate it or not? Are they adapting or are they degrading? And then you make a decision based on that information.
You mentioned earlier, Brad, about the recovery piece and how tissues adapt or maladapt, right? And you talk about the programming piece. Interested to see what your thoughts on the timing in season, let's say, of a pitcher who, is a reliever and he's going to go 3 out of 4. How do you help suggest what kind of loading they should do outside of the game? So you got your arm care programs, you have your upper body lifts. We know that heavy eccentrics can take over 48 hours for it to recover, from a collagen standpoint on a tendon. So during those heavy periods, how do you help, guide the player and what he should be doing outside of the field, the ballpark, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is like, how do we maximize recovery while still keeping them on track with whatever performance and conditioning needs they have? And I think it starts with conversations with the player and, the rest of the, performance staff. So we understand where he's sitting in terms of his recovery and whether it's in that fatigued state or not. I don't think anybody would argue with you if you can demonstrate that somebody has a muscle group or a particular body part that is in a fatigue state and that there should be some modification in terms of what they would typically do if they were in a more adaptive state. And, I don't think no exercise is the right answer either. I think exercise can be actually a great tool to use for recovery if dosed correctly. For us in the training room side of it, doing isometrics, I think, is a very safe and therapeutic way to stimulate muscle contraction without, contributing to some of that maladaptation or degrading of the tissue. I think it's additive. In the weight room, again, like having those conversations with smart people that hopefully can evaluate. You may have a situation where systemically they are actually recovering well, but more specifically and locally to a particular body part, they're not. So in other words, we all know that a starting pitcher often does lower body lift within the first 2 days following a start because their lower body probably is recovering, and we try to spare the arm a little bit because the arm maybe is not. So I think those are the type of strategies that I use through conversations and trying to understand where the player's at.
Yeah, that makes me think of a player that I talked to recently within the last year, and he was off season. He was feeling great, and he was going in, and he had a scheduled lift upper body, and he ended up doing some heavy eccentric pull-ups. And then the very next day, he was doing some max intent pull downs before he started throwing. And he ended up with a strain, and he was like, "Man, I just don't understand." It's like, well, you didn't allow your tissues to recover before you did max intent activity. Like it could be as simple as just timing out your loading, allostatic load, and your throwing program, like meshing those together so that way you can maximize your ability to perform. That's one example that comes to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes again why I thought it was interesting to understand like the cyclical loading and the magnitude aspect of how many cycles you want. If you want to throw aside on day 2 or day 3, even, how much intensity should you throw? And we know that if the magnitude of I mean, it's intuitive. I think it's not that people aren't thinking about this, but you have a finite amount of cycles that you can handle. If the person you feel is not fully recovered, which oftentimes by day 2 they're not, like you would be able to do more at a lesser magnitude. But I think that there's a lot of pressure these days for the pitcher to go out there and hit the metrics, on their bullpen days too, in order to have an idea of what the spin rates are and what the movement of their pitches are, and to evaluate even their mechanics because they want it in with full speed. So that's sometimes an area that I push back on and saying, is that productive or is that additive to the problem?
And you brought this up earlier, Brad, but you talked about the player relationship piece of this too. And I think that's important in this part of the conversation, as far as I think there is some intuitiveness to the players and how they feel and what they go about wanting to do on a day-to-day basis. There are the moments like Paul just described where maybe some prescription could change and what they're being told to do could be more appropriate, so we don't get in these positions. But I feel like, especially for some of the veteran players, they have an idea of how their body's feeling and what they're capable of. But our ability to kind of have that conversation with them based on what we're feeling on the table, based on what we're paying attention to make these minor adjustments to maximize their availability for when they actually have to compete, I think become a really interesting piece that is a little nuanced and a little not as quantitative, and maybe a little bit more the art piece of this objective scientific part of it. So I think it's just really interesting the just bringing up just the conversation with the player, and remembering what the ultimate goal is. And I'm curious, we're talking about injury prevention and monitoring those things, but there's a place for performance here too, right? Of making sure that they're available to perform well. And in a world of baseball pitching where it's so biomechanically on the edges of human capabilities at really, really high levels, right? We're asking for maximum forces and maximum end ranges of motions and things like that. How does the performance piece come into the conversation when you start talking to position coaches and things like that about what they should be doing to prepare for game day or game time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on development, using the time before the games or in between games to work on development. And, my caution is that it is hard to to fit it all in. And I always use the analogy of if we have, when you were in school, you might have, 6 classes or something like that. And each teacher is saying like, it's only 2 hours of homework a night. And like, yeah, but 6 times 2 is 12 hours. I don't have time to sleep and eat and then also go to your classes. So, if everybody's pecking at this player and taking something from them, it has to be in concert. And I actually think like modern teams are doing a pretty good job of trying to schedule things a little bit better. And when it's a high day here, it's a low day there type of scenario. But I don't want to get into a place where it feels like medical, or certainly I speak for myself in my department, is trying to hold players back. I actually think it goes in both directions. When, again, to pick on a metric, if the metric says that, you're not in the sweet spot, but the player is like, look, I feel great. I want to do more. I could throw another 10 in the pen, or I could, go to early hitting. I feel great. And then, if you have other measures that are pointing in that direction, like why let, kind of a broad metric, dictate what someone is feeling. I don't think that's right either. And in that case, you're using better judgment, and certainly talking to the players to maximize what they can do instead of trying to emphasize what they can't do.
And then that becomes part of our role as athletic trainers, right? Is to provide context for what we're measuring, right? Because you get these reports and the guy's he's a red, or he's in the problematic state of whatever we're paying attention to, and then people who maybe don't have the understanding of what we're measuring would see that and automatically think they shouldn't play or they shouldn't do this, and that shouldn't be the case. This, like anything else we talk about on this podcast or any discussions we have at winter meetings together, or anything along those lines, it's always just like a piece of a really big puzzle that we're constantly trying to solve. And I think that's a piece from the workload standpoint that it is, in my opinion, it's not the silver bullet that's going to predict and it's going to tell us and we should be following. We kind of alluded to this in the beginning. It's an imperfect piece that we're continuing to refine and hopefully get better at. But there's always some context to be understood about what we're looking at on a day-to-day basis. And I think we're pointing towards the importance of just being prepared when you show up to spring training, and the ability to kind of handle all of the stresses that go up when you start actually competing, as opposed to just focusing on preparing and have to be on the field as well. So, it's really good.
Yeah, the other piece I was going to mention here is that, Brad, you talked about the theoretical foundation of having a higher chronic workload it makes sense, right? You want to build up and be more resilient. You want to build that tissue resiliency. The only way to do that is through exposures. And so a lot of times we may be pushing forward and saying, like, I think this guy should do more early on. But then the other piece too is like the interpretation of a workload metric, whatever you're tracking. If a guy's underloaded and you have a little color scheme and the guy's in blue, let's say, and he's underloaded and he goes to a red immediately because now he's overloaded. Well, that was a big change, right? The delta between those two was pretty high. Whereas another guy may be just kind of creeping towards that in a moderate range and maybe more, building up to a more significant range. Those two cases, one had a big delta, a big change, and their response to that workload may be different because there was a large change. What the body doesn't like is a lot of change abruptly. But another guy's kind of like almost like a frog in boiling water. Like he doesn't understand, like he's being boiled because he, feels that he's not feeling or sensing that buildup of workload. So I think that kind of makes some contextual interpretation that Joe's talking about matter, because a guy who may be in the red, but it was kind of like built up to that a little bit, and maybe he's already previously been exposed to that type of workload, may be able to handle that better than a guy who's been chronically underloaded, and then all of a sudden he hits the red for the first time.
Yeah, it's a really complicated thing to try to sort out, to be honest. And you're absolutely right, Paul. Like, you have to contextualize it. And again, that's where someone might say, like, we're a data-driven sports medicine team and all that. I still push back on that and say we're a data-informed sports medicine team, somebody still has to synthesize what that data is saying, because I just don't think we're good enough yet. I mean, it's with AI. I mean, we very well may be very close to that, but right now, I still think that you need to contextualize it. There's different examples I can give. I'll share a story here in a second, but first, let me give an example of a couple things in real world that we've seen. Paul, you remember a shortstop we had that if we were measuring his chronic load, he was playing every day. And so if you are trying to imagine an acute spike on somebody who's already at 150 out of 153 games played, it's really hard to spike that person's workload. But I still believe, if they played an extra inning game back in those days and ended up playing 18 innings instead of 9, I don't care what the number says. He's experienced something different, is more fatigued, even though that ratio probably isn't as impactful as the bench player who is in the game this week 4 out of 6 games instead of riding the pine. So I think you do have to contextualize and say, even though those numbers may look opposite, the guy who played 18 innings might be more tired than the bench player in that scenario. Another example would be in a relief situation where you have this kind of swingman reliever that's in the beginning of the season is pitching all the time, bridging between starter and back of the bullpen. After a while, their chronic load gets built up pretty high. So their ratio may not look bad, but we know that they've been grinding. They're carrying the load for us. So without contextualizing, we don't know if the chronic load is fitness or is fatigue. It's really hard to discern on its own. You have to get into the weeds with that analysis. That's why I say the tolerance kind of feedback loop is really important. And I'll give now my story. I have a friend, his name's Alan McCall. He's a sports scientist, and he travels around the world. Part of his job for the team he works for is to kind of have conversations like these with specialists around the world. And he was meeting with an F1 racing company or team, I should say. And he was observing how they have accelerometers and different measuring tools on every single component of the car. And they can determine to the fraction of a second when that part will fatigue and fail. And so he said casually to the team, "Hey, that's amazing. You must know exactly when that car needs to go into the pit and get things changed out." And they said, no, the funny thing is, all the parts individually, they can predict when it fails. Once you put all the pieces together, they can't predict shit, is what they said. So it makes me kind of chuckle, because I'm like, well, if they can't do it with a machine, how the heck are we going to do it with a human body? I think it just speaks to how difficult a job we have in trying to predict anything.
That reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from a research article is Becker in 16. I say it all the time. It's single factors are probably not going to account for large variations in effect size, because once you couple the system together, it all interacts in unpredictable ways, right? So that's why it has to be moderated by context. A single data point is not going to be to your point. We're not a data driven. We're data informed. I think we're limited by our measurement right now.
Yeah, all of our measurements are surrogates for the actual thing we care about anyways. There's not a measurement that I know of, at least. If there is one, please share. That says every throw, this is how much the UCL got stressed. We're talking about proxies of that stress, but we don't yet have the actual load that it's bearing, and it may be different pitch to pitch, may be different. This person throwing 95, it may be a different stress than this other person, specifically at that tissue level.
This feels like a good place to just kind of talk about where we're going. from here based off of those last couple stories? Because I think they're good summaries of the whole thing. From your standpoint, Brad and Paul, I'd love your take on this too. But where do you see the research in this topic going from what we know now, and maybe what the need still is, or what we still need to refine? Where would you like to see the research go on this topic?
Kind of staying with my central theme of what interested me about the paper is understanding what the load tolerance is for specific tissues over a number of cycles. And they have done some studies on ACLs. I know there's a famous wallaby tail study, which people sometimes cite, but trying to understand, for specific tissues that we care about in baseball, particularly UCL is the one I always think about. But what is the load tolerance of the UCL, across many, many submaximal loads, cyclically loading it? I know we've done more of the tensile load, and we cited all the time that it would fail. The cadaver model fails without muscular intervention during throwing. But what about submaximal and just kind of that micro trauma load? Where is that SN curve with the ligament? So that's one thing. I think it would be the technology of measurement that, with whether it's wearables or whatnot, that could better understand what's happening, each throw from a true elbow stress would be great. I'll pause for a second and say, like, there's a study that I'm forgetting who did it, but I can put into the show notes. When you impact the ground, the thought was that's telling you how much impact is happening on the shin. But what actually they found was the impact on the forces on the ground didn't explain the stresses on the shin, because it was actually the muscle forces that are acting upon the shin that created the stress on the shin. So it wasn't just the hitting the ground; it was actually the muscles that were reacting to hitting the ground. And I think that's kind of an area of research that I would also push into and say, if we can get better at describing like what's actually happening at the tissue level in these two ways, I think we can program a little bit better for our players.
Yeah, I agree. Tissue adaptation. I think that's where it goes. You're wondering why injuries occur. You're wondering why there's performance deficits or related to workload. I think it comes down to the tissue adaptation. Are they adapting positively or negatively? And we don't yet know. I mean, we have these surrogates that tell us, the UCL can handle this and the throw does this. But even then, from a biomechanical model, they're limited in what they're measuring, right? They're measuring on the UCL specifically peak torque. The researchers are starting to talk about cumulative torque, right? Because the UCL doesn't like, chronic loads of stressing the tissue and then letting it creep too far, right? So, to Brad's point, the dynamic stabilizers are taking on a lot. So what point do those dynamic stabilizers not do their job and causes plastic changes?
Yeah, and then you fold in the to try and spend a second here on the psychological side of it and some of these other internal measures. If you've been in a fatigue state from a workload standpoint and you flew across the country and didn't get sleep and had to go out and play, and your HRV is low and some of these internal measures are not optimal, those are connected to the tissue, but they aren't the tissue, and they can influence the tissue. So now combining those things can influence, okay, this ligament is degrading and not adapting, and I need those muscles to fire properly, but they're tired because I did an inappropriate workout, or I traveled across country and I'm tired, or, I got crappy sleep, dehydrated, whatever, now it becomes multiplicative in that way, it's like, so where the research goes, like, fix that and I'll be happy.
Well, it's interesting that as much as I feel like we're growing and learning on this topic and the numbers, it's what seems to be a simple question of where do we go from here turns into another, a few minute conversation of all the different stuff that we can still develop and get better at and learn. And there's still a lot of work to be done. But on that note, I think we could keep going on this conversation for a long time, and methinks there's probably a future episode of the Research Rundown where we revisit this conversation and maybe see what we could poke holes in ourselves or what we've learned since then. But Brad, thanks for the time. Thanks for the topic. Thanks for the discussion. Paul, same. Thanks for being here today. And I think this is another great episode of the Research Rundown, and looking forward to the next time. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Inside Athletic Training Podcast. For more information about PBATS and the profession of athletic training, visit pbats.com. See you next time.